Hi, welcome to How to RPG. My name is Fred Wheeler, and today I want to talk about building tree houses, or should I say a tree town or tree village in your fantasy adventures. How do you go about doing that? Well, as it happens, I have some material, some information, some guidance for you. Part of what I did in the past was I used to build stuff. I used to make furniture, I've built houses, stuff like that. So I do have some skills in this area. This is going to be a very broad overview. It's not going to be that explicit because we're dealing with fantasy, not with real world mechanics so much. But bear with me and we'll see how this turns out. In any case, if you're going to make a town from trees where people are going to live in them, it really comes down to building a tree house or tree houses. So you can't really have a hollowed out tree without killing it. So if you're going to live inside the tree, which would be nice, that would kill the tree. Then you don't really have a tree anymore. You just have a dead trunk. That's it. So unless the tree that is hollowed out is petrified or fossilized, it's not really going to work. Of course, there are ways of getting around that, but let's deal with that first. First of all, you're going to need, if you're going to have a town, you need to have a stand of trees that are large enough to support something like this construction, and they need to be fairly close together. They can't be too widely spread. You need to pick a very large tree with no dead branches or dead sections in it, and certainly nothing that is currently rotting. And of course, you can usually tell by what's growing on it if it's a dead tree. If there's fungus growing on it and there's a lot of moss, chances are that tree is heading towards death. Okay, and they can live for a long time as they slowly die off. Next, you need to construct a platform for the tree around, or the tree house, okay, for that house that you're going to put in there, around the main trunk with really strong timbers. Okay, whatever lumber you're using, it needs to be extremely strong. So all your bearers need to be quite thick, quite strong. You can't shortcut that. Bracing around the platform would be absolutely vital. These are usually diagonals, anything that will allow the actual structure of the platform, particularly on the outside, since that's going to be the weakest point. You need to have something that's supporting it, usually angled. Next, materials. The materials you use need to be able to resist rot and erosion or corrosion. Anything that will break down when it's close to something that's living. Because a tree is living, it has a lot of moisture in it, and therefore that moisture will go into the timber. So you need to make sure if you're using timbers, it can resist rotting. If you're using any kind of metal, it needs to be able to resist corrosion. And if you're using anything else that might erode because of moisture from the tree, you need to make sure it can actually resist that. So you need to find the right types of materials to do that. Next, fixing using nails, screws, bolts and nuts. Bolts and nuts are going to be your greatest tool because they give you the strongest support, but of course they'll only be dealing with the structural side of things rather than the cosmetic side of things. Next, timbers need to be treated with chemicals to ensure they do not rot. Tools for cutting, securing and measuring will absolutely be required. So whether you're using a saw or an axe or some sort of machine, whether you're using a hammer or a nail gun, and measuring tapes, anything to deal with making sure that something is level. The plumb bowl and the string line are going to be one of your friends. Okay, the construction of walls needs to allow for ventilation. Whenever you build a structure, okay, it always has to allow for ventilation. Windows allow for ventilation, but you can also put vents into a structure like a house. And of course, doors provide ventilation that can be opened and closed when you need to. You might even have shutters on this thing just in case you have to deal with weather. But the great thing about building something in a tree is it's usually quite well protected by being in the crown of the tree or the head where all the leaves are. Unless, of course, it's one of those trees that loses all the leaves during winter. The roof will need a slope, but not as much as a normal house due to the fact that the tree canopy will probably protect it from rainfall. The reason for a roof is, one, to stop anything from getting in through the top. Of course, you will probably have to clear off your roof quite often, clear out those gutters maybe, you might say, just because of the fact that there's going to be a lot of dead material falling on there from the tree as the leaves die off. A fireplace in a tree house is a ridiculous design goal due to the fact that there's such a high risk of fire, so you need to have a different method of heating that space. Now maybe that's going to take the form of having a hearth that's made of stone. Putting stone in a tree is quite hard, okay? So you might not be going for that. You might look for a different source. It might be that you have a fire, you heat stones, those stones are then carted up with a lift of some kind, and then they are placed in a container that doesn't transfer the heat into the tree or into the house itself, with it causing a fire. So you're going to look at a different way of heating. And of course, insulation, you can always incorporate things like mats and tapestries, rugs, things like that. Setting up a pulley system to allow for the building materials during the building process to is actually really sensible, because you need to be able to bring everything up to the level wherever you've positioned your house in the tree. It might be quite high, it might be quite low, it doesn't really matter, but you need to have something to get everything there. Also, you need to be able to transport passengers either with a ladder or some sort of lift system, probably using a pulley and rope, to get to the house itself. Now, magic will absolutely be required if you want to seamlessly integrate the concept of a house, okay, or a building into a living tree. It's just one of those things. You can't do it any other way, because if you look at things in terms of how things work in the real world, to transfer that over to a fantasy adventure, you have to use magic. And of course, you don't really need any other answers to how to create a tree house when you're using magic, other than we did it with magic. Okay. Now, I hope that was useful to you. I have provided you with a lot of odd and more practical methods for building a tree village, a tree house, a tree town. I'm hoping this was useful to you, and if it was, great. I want to say thank you to my patrons who support me on Patreon. I want to thank you for watching and listening to what I had to say, and hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.